What is psychoanalysis? What is Gestalt psychology? And what is behaviorism? In this video, you'll learn about each of these schools of thinking within the field of psychology. In this video, you'll learn about some of the major fields or branches of psychology, including biological and evolutionary psychology, sensation and perception, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, personality psychology, social psychology, and more. So biopsychology is a very interesting area of study, and it really draws on many fields, and so it's interdisciplinary. So it's drawing on biology, on chemistry, and in the medical field as well. And biological psychologists, they're studying how our nervous system is structured, and then they're also interested in how the nervous system functions to generate behavior. They're also interested in how hormones can affect behavior. So for those of you who are majoring in a field within the health sciences, you might find this area of particular interest. We'll be exploring this a lot further when we get into Module 3 in this course. Evolutionary psychologists are interested in studying behavior and how you can predict behavior based on evolutionary theory. And if you'll remember, we started talking about this a little bit when we talked about William James. And so I would encourage you to go back in your book and read a little bit more about William James if you're not remembering from your readings what you've learned about him. And so the evolutionary psychologist is going to focus on how are behaviors explained through the lens of survival and reproduction. So in other words, what behaviors might we engage in that are going to be promoting survival and reproduction? And then again, how can we explain behaviors through those lenses? One of the issues with evolutionary psychology is it's very much based on theories and kind of reflecting on those concepts of survival and reproduction and how they can be tied to behavior instead of experimentally being able to study those things. And whereas biological psychology, you could experimentally test how one part of the nervous system or one perhaps network, for example, in the brain or a structure within the brain affects behavior. So you can do experimental studies within that field of biological psychology. So this next area of study that we're going to look at is cognitive psychology. And this is an area of psychology that focuses on cognition, and cognition means thinking. And so how do our thought processes, how we perceive information, how we organize information, how does that affect how we feel? How does that affect how we behave? And so cognitive psychologists are interested in attention, problem solving, language, and memory. And they might work with, for example, linguists. They might work, for example, with teachers who are wanting to know how to promote learning. and through that understanding of how we process information and organize information. They'll also work with cognitive or with computer scientists to get the best understanding of the mind as possible. So you can think about artificial intelligence, AI, and so this is going to be of great importance. Also, how do we sustain attention? That's an interesting area. How do we make decisions? How do we solve problems? And how do we develop language? How can we improve memory? How do we form memories? How do we retrieve memories? And so in this course, there are many different modules that are going to have cognitive aspects to them. But in particular, in Module 7, which is on thinking and intelligence, we're going to be looking at that. And then in Module 8, we'll be looking at memory. So a very interesting area within psychology is industrial organizational psychology. And we can think, first of all, why this is interesting. One main reason is because we spend a lot of time at work. And so in this particular area, psychology is applying, or psychologists are applying the theories, the principles, and the research findings in work settings. And so there are some very interesting trends in industrial organizational psychology, some areas that are of interest today. And that includes globalization, sexual harassment, automation and artificial intelligence, internet recruiting, and work-life balance and employee health. So, for example, with globalization, workplaces are becoming more globalized, and this means that there'll need to be a greater sense of awareness of cross-cultural issues in the workplace. And the more diverse workforce means that rather than imposing a set of organizational standards throughout global companies, it's going to be more effective for teams to have standards that are reflective of local practices. And this sort of relates to what we're going to be looking at in just a little bit, multicultural psychology. But this is in a workplace, so we can put this into industrial organizational psychology as well. And along with globalization comes an increasingly remote workforce, and this has happened with coronavirus. So here we have some industrial organizational psychology interests here as well. And this remote working presents challenges for collaboration, communication, and building a sense of teamwork that industrial organizational psychologists, which are also called IO psychologists, may want to address. In terms of sexual harassment, this is a top trend, and a majority of American women voters have actually have said that they experience sexual harassment, and many men have experienced this as well, and most of them experience this at work. So from an IO psychology standpoint, organizations will need to look at their culture, their policies, and training to start to address these conditions that can lead to workplace harassment. In terms of automation and artificial intelligence, over the next decade, we're going to be seeing a growing number of jobs that are going to be automated. This has been happening already, but it's going to be happening at an increasingly fast pace. And this is expected to lead to widespread disruption in the workplace. And organizations may need to address issues like morale and training. And as artificial intelligence begins to perform increasingly sophisticated tasks, then IO psychologists may begin to look at whether and how people form relationships with the AI that they work with. And the increasing use of big data that will be able to improve performance and then track a number of other things is going to be of importance. So these technological innovations may also raise ethical questions that psychologists will examine. Internet recruiting, this has been going on for a long time, and this is another area for IO psychologists. So many employers, most are recruiting through the internet rather than, of course, through help wanted sections in newspapers. Probably most of you have never looked at a help wanted section in an actual physical newspaper. Many of you are probably looking online. And older populations, they're increasingly comfortable in using computers. This type of recruitment might still tend to skew towards younger workers, and it may be something that organizations need to address. So computer-based applications can provide feedback also to applicants, and organizations might they might be interested in wanting to consider how they can make the best use of these opportunities that are offered by online recruiting and information gathering, combined with things like interviews and other more traditional methods of recruiting and selecting for employment. I think of my sister, for example. My sister lives in San Francisco. The city is basically, through COVID, been locked down. And so she's looking for a job. She lost her job because of coronavirus. And so all of her job seeking has been, of course, through online, and she has interviewed online. And she probably will not meet her employer when she gets hired. She'll probably get hired and continue to work from home. So this is a very different environment, a very different way of working and interviewing than has been done in the past. Also, I think we should think about the use of social media, and some of you many of you probably have thought about this, that the use of social media has been very popular, and it has increased in popularity in selecting or rejecting candidates. And people who are on social media, they may come under more scrutiny. And so there are even companies, I'm sure most of you know, or many of you may know, who can manage how you appear online. So you might Google yourself and see what comes up. And if you don't like what's coming up, maybe it's not something you want your employer to see. Perhaps it's a particular, maybe it's something you've said online. Maybe it's social media images that you want to create a certain impression about yourself. Maybe it's images from, you're out with your friends and maybe you're out drinking with your friends. You don't want those images. You don't want the potential employer to see you in that light. And so there are companies that manage that, and so that they can have an effect on how you're perceived online. And then most of us, when we think about the workplace, we think about the pressures that work brings and how it can often be difficult to balance work with our own personal lives. And so IO psychologists can focus on this. Unhealthy employees, of course, for companies means that there's less productivity, and then there's also more time lost from work, and there's more turnover, and this can be very costly. So companies will hire IO psychologists to address this. And so when companies address work-life balance and employee health, it benefits both the employee and the workplace. But there can also be issues like privacy, and this can be of very important significance when we're thinking about workplace health, wellness programs. And so this is something that IO psychologists will examine. I think of, for example, companies that they do not give vacation time. They don't say, for example, you have 2 weeks a year or 4 weeks a year of vacation. I've heard of companies that instead will say to their employees, when you feel like you need to take off, you can take off, because they want that employee to have that balance, and they find that their employees are much more productive when they're doing that. So I think many of us may think of more conventional ways of working and allocating benefits, but there are some very interesting ways of providing benefits to employees and provide, like vacation time, or the environment that you create, allowing pets to come into the workplace. There's lots of interesting things that employers do that can lead to increased morale and decreased turnover. I think one other that I want to point out to you, or one other thing I want to point out to you, is if you're interested in majoring in business and you also like psychology, this is a great area to go into. It's actually very lucrative. You can make a lot of money in this field. It's one of the higher paying fields within psychology, and it's really interesting, and you can have a very positive effect on people's lives working in this field. Another very interesting area within the field of psychology that many of you might find interesting, especially because I find that many students that I have are health science majors. They're wanting to go into nursing, radiology, they plan on going to pharmacy school, or they're pre-med. This is health psychology, and you may have heard of this as behavioral medicine, and this is a subfield of psychology where the main concern is, how do our biology, our psychology, and our behavior, our social factors, how are those involved in our physical health, and how are they involved in illness? And so health psychology steers away from a simple linear model of health, and it considers illness as a product of many different factors, and that we're not just, as people, we're not passive victims of external forces like of viruses or bacteria, but that we actually have some control, we have some accountability for our health. And we're responsible for the activities that we choose to engage in. And this might include smoking, our diet, drinking alcohol, and engaging in exercise. And so this field of psychology takes a biopsychosocial approach. And so it's a combination of biological processes like viruses and tumors, and then psychological processes like stress, beliefs, and cognitions or thinking, and then behaviors and actions like risk-taking and gambling, for example, and then social factors like a way of life, or what community do you live in? And although it's common knowledge that illnesses can be contagious and hereditary, there are behavioral and psychological factors that need to be considered, because these have significant effects on overall physical well-being and the medical conditions that people have. So the things that we do, the way that we process information, the environment that we live in, our career choice, our life challenges, and even family dynamics can have great impacts on our health. and on illness. And so a person who's more likely to develop, for example, let's say a person is more likely to develop respiratory symptoms or maybe allergies if they live in a damp and mildew infested home. One is more susceptible to physical and psychological diseases when they're under stress. And stress weakens our immune system as our body's producing chemicals that aren't necessary when we are not under stress. And so these chemicals and hormones that our body produces, they're helpful when we are under acute stress sometimes, but if we're chronically stressed, this can be harmful. And this is, this also can this can also be related to, career choice as well. So career choice, for example, is very important in terms of our health. There are some instances where we might find that a work environment can cause too much stress on a person, and then that of course can have an effect on a person's health and well-being. So we would find within health psychology that there is overall an interest in having an in-depth understanding of health and illness, in focusing on behaviors and experiences that promote health or give rise to illness, and then influence the effectiveness of healthcare. And these also can be individuals who might be interested in working on healthcare policy. And this field then can help people to be equipped to have knowledge of disease prevention by having, coming up with techniques and interventions like stress reduction and behavioral change. So you'll find that many hospitals employ health psychologists. They're also employed by governments. They're also, they work in universities doing research, and then this research trickles down into affecting policy and then of course policy is related to where do government funds go? How can we increase health and well-being by looking at behavior, by looking at our environment? It's a very interesting field of study. So probably when you signed up for this course, you thought about psychological disorders and the treatment of disorders. Probably many of you thought of this because this is what we tend to think of when we think about clinical or when we think about psychology, and that is clinical psychology. But as you can see, psychology involves much more than just the treatment of disorders or in understanding psychological disorders. But clinical psychology focuses on the psychological aspects of human functioning in various socioeconomic, clinical, and cultural groups, as well as different age groups. And they often will take a lifespan approach so that they can understand how earlier experiences may affect how you currently feel, how you currently think. And the aim of clinical psychology is to understand, to be able to predict, to treat or to alleviate disorders or disabilities or any kind of maladjustment. And this involves areas of specific competence, and so having clinical judgment and also being able to understand how we can prevent psychological disorders, how we can promote human adaptation and adjustment and personal development. In this video, you've learned about the many fields or branches within psychology. Which one do you find most interesting? In the next series of videos, you'll learn about the various methods that psychologists use to study human and animal behavior. If you like this video, please select the like button and select the subscribe button for more videos like this.